I got interested in Japan when I was at Cambridge University, because that's when I met my first Japanese student who was preparing to be an ambassador. And I have known him all his life until last year. And then I became interested in African studies. And so I was invited to Japan, I think in 1991, when I met my second set of Japanese friends. And one of them came to the University of Edinburgh, and he's now a very old friend of mine. He's a professor in Osaka University. And I was lucky enough to come with my wife and spend 6 months, 3 months in Hirodai and 3 months in Nagoya University. And so this allowed me to continue to engage with Japanese friends. And in that process, I became interested in what was special about Japan in terms of its aid. So although I spent the last 10 years looking at China's aid to Africa, I've always been interested in the contrast between China and Japan. It's a term that we worked out together a year ago when I was here at Nagoya University, and with Kayashima-san and Tambo-san here in the JICA RI, we thought this is an interesting idea, Japaneseness. So I began to think, what are the different kinds of Japaneseness? And in particular, because I'd been looking at aid for a long time, I thought, what is different about the way that Japan does its technical cooperation? And luckily, when I came here last year, Japan the cabinet had just released their development cooperation charter. So I looked inside it and I saw some very unusual words for Japan. I saw soft power. That's a very Chinese word, soft power. So I thought, oh, what's that about? Then I saw Japanese language. And historically, Japan has always been rather worried about promoting the Japanese language, ever since before the Second World War. So I thought, are things changing here? Because what I knew of Japanese aid was that it was a very slow process, with people gradually working with their counterparts, maybe taking 5 years to develop a project. And suddenly in this new document, I saw the word very frequently, proactive. I thought, what does that mean? And I thought, maybe the answer is, become more like China. Be quick. And then I looked carefully and I found words like resilient, active. I thought, this means that maybe Japan is under some pressure to speed up and catch up, particularly in Africa. So that was one of the things I began to look at. And as I looked further, just last week, I was lucky enough to be at a meeting, and I began to see that there were documents called Japan Brand ODA. I thought, that sounds like a marketing operation. That sounds very different from, Japanese experts in the field, Gemba, JOCV working on a small amount of money for 2 years. This sounds more like an export operation. So then I found out that there was indeed another version of Japaneseness, which was to export Japanese health ideas and systems to the developing world. And there was also an interest in education, in exporting, I wondered what. Not perhaps the famous JICA friends, science and maths, lesson study, laboratory-based education, but maybe new friends like, I wonder what, maybe Japanese approaches to moral education, Japanese curriculum, Japanese language. So I realized that under this new banner of private-public platform for exporting best practice overseas, one might find a different version of Japaneseness. So I haven't investigated that, but it is clear that there is something like that being encouraged. And that was the origin of my interest in exploring what I might call JICA Japaneseness and New Style Japaneseness, and there may be other versions of Japaneseness as well. So that's where I am at the moment. Well, I was lucky to be accompanied by Sakamaki-san from this organization, and we visited in good Japanese style. We got up very early and we went to bed very late, and we visited many, many projects. But the ones that are of greatest interest for my topic of Japaneseness were visiting the Japan Center, Cambodia Japan Cooperation Center, which is in Phnom Penh, Royal University of Phnom Penh. Very interesting. If you didn't know what 5S was, you could find a real demonstration of 5S, except that they had changed it into 7S. They had invented two more S's, one of which is save. I think the other one is security, but I'm not absolutely sure. But here was a very interesting example of a Japanese senior advisor working with the director from Cambodia and creating a really interesting Japanese Cambodian. It wasn't promotion of Japan only. It was a Japanese Cambodian hybrid, you might almost call it. So I found it a very interesting example of what I'd been trying to look at. And the second thing I guess I noticed when we went away up country to a hospital, and I met a JOCV there, a woman called Minori, and believe it or not, her job was to make the hospital interested in 5S. She had gone to Sri Lanka, she'd found out about 5S with the director and the deputy director, and they'd come back and they were trying to develop 5S to organize the hospital more in the 5S fashion. Again, I think it was not just a straight export from Japan, because the export was actually from Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka had developed their ideas about 5S for the hospital service, and now here was Cambodia being invited, third country training in Sri Lanka, and bringing their version back into the hospital. So I thought those are two interesting examples of just what I had talked about earlier, the, if you like, a JICA tradition of trying to work over a long period in ways that do reflect something of Japan's expertise, but endogenizing it and localizing it and making it appropriate to the particular country. So I saw a lot more in Cambodia, but those were two of the examples that I most noticed in terms of Japaneseness. I think I'll connect that to what I was saying earlier. I think in the documents that I've been reading to make the to understand more about Japaneseness, I have read seen lots of references to lesson study, science and maths education, school-based management, and so on. But what I haven't been able to find, although I've looked in the library, I haven't been able to find really interesting examples of how the process worked. How did the experts from Japan actually work in Kenya? People like Sugiyama-san, how did he work with his Kenyan counterparts over 5 or 10 years to create this new process, Kenyan process? How did he make the Kenyans believe it was theirs, not a JICA project? How did it become sustainable? I find it very difficult to find good examples, good analysis of how that process happens. So I think what would be interesting as a recommendation would be, why don't we take in education some of the best known comparative advantages of Japan, science and maths, lesson study, school-based management, and actually have accessible to the international public and to Japan short, sharp analyses of the histories of how those things actually became Kenyan, became Filipino, became based in Niger or wherever they have become. Because otherwise we have lots of references to these being Japan's expertise, but we don't understand the process. And I think what's missing is the history of the process and the key role of working side by side with Kenyan, I don't like the word counterpart, but Kenyan partners, or Philippine partners, or Malaysian partners. So that's what I am looking for, and that would be, I think, very valuable beyond the position papers, the policy papers, all the promises about what we'll do. How did you do it? That would be my recommendation.